So we're on time period 3. Can anyone tell me the dates of time period 3?
1815 to 1914.
Correct. So we know 1815 is the end of Napoleon's time and power in France. What's 1914? I saw
World War One.
mouthing it. Yes, World War I, correct. So the beginning of World War I, which for us doesn't exist unless it's a post-context item on your DBQ, which it certainly could be. I'm still convinced you're going to see 1450 to 1914 as the parameters of your DBQ, leaving you the entire 20th century for any post-context you would like. Now, speaking of DBQ, before I get too far, I don't know if anybody saw it, but Mr. McDonald and I literally had like a 30-minute phone conversation on Friday at lunch after I'd done all those Zoom sessions. And the guy that he got this XABY format from, the gentleman who helps write the APUS test, which is what Euro and World were based off in terms of the structure. That guy posted, he teaches in Texas. He was like, my kids are not getting this done in 45 minutes. So what we've done, and then Mr. McDonald and I agreed, so I hate the fact that I changed it after y'all wrote it. And if you wrote it the other way, it's fine. We're cutting out B. We're basically doing XAY. So I see Elizabeth smiling because she already did her DBQ. Sorry. But I posted, so I don't know if you saw it. If you didn't, it's totally cool. But Mr. McDonald said his U.S. kids did one DBQ last week, and he said his best kids were struggling to finish. So we're just going to cut out the B, and just so that would be XAY. So instead of a perfect 5-paragraph essay, the perfect, which doesn't exist, is a 4-paragraph. And for many of us, it's going to be 3 if we don't even get to the last paragraph, the post-context. So it's the context thesis, it's the X idea, and then it's the A idea. And how you divide your HIPs and your outside evidence and your document numbers is entirely up to you. You could have 1 document for X and 3 for A. It's just depending on what the documents say and how comfortable you are with the material. So it doesn't have to be, 1 outside evidence for this paragraph, 1 for that paragraph. You can, but you don't have to. It's entirely up to you. So as you write this week, and again, thank you to those of you who already turned it in. I'm going to try to grade those today. And then if you can get this done earlier in the week, that'd be awesome, just because it allows me to then give you feedback and you see it. And then next Monday, we can have an actual conversation. Obviously, if I'm having conversations next Monday with my seniors and 25 people turn it in Monday night at 11:30, I'm too damn old to stay up till 3 in the morning and grade. Okay, I just am. So I would really appreciate, I know y'all are busy, but this is really the last thing I'm asking for you to do is to write these last 2 DBQs. So if that's possible, I really would appreciate it. And as promised, if anybody's got a B+ or I'll hook you up. I'll make sure that I'll find a way to give you something easy to do so you can get that grade up in light of our circumstances. I think that's only fair. So anyway, let's start on page 132, 6.2. Oddly enough, it starts with Industrial Revolution. I would argue the main concept of this time period, shockingly enough, also very easy for you to write about because you know a lot of the details about it. So the Industrial Revolution I would define as the majority of manufacturing processes changing from manual labor to machine labor. So we're going from animal power or human power to machine-based power. Now we know that is not an immediate shift. We know it's gradual. We know that many of us are still farming in the 19th century. It does not mean that everything is mechanized completely right away. Britain, of course, is our first nation. France will join in. We see Northern Italy. We'll see eventually the Dutch, the Germans, etc. But it's a process. Even by 1914, much of Europe has still yet to engage with. The Russians have a 6,000-mile long railroad, but the rest of it's kind of crappy. As we may remember, they shoot more bullets in World War I than their factories can make in a day than their factories can make in a month. So they just don't really have the industrial capacity. So we made a big list in class back in the fall, or maybe it was the spring, I can't remember when we did this, about this process. I think it was January, about why Britain, why are they the first nation? They've got a massive supply of natural resources, things like coal, things like iron that are essential. What is the main engine driving all of this production? Literal engine.
The steam engine.
Steam engine, yes ma'am. Invented in time period 2, but is small, so therefore it's mobile. You can put these in anywhere. You can put a bunch of them together to increase capacity. So our factories are going to be built in cities because that's where the labor is. That's also where transportation is to get to our customers, such as rivers. That's also where our customers are. So we have to be able to sell our goods, and otherwise we don't make any money and then we don't exist. So We know that the British have a glut of land, labor, and capital. They've got a lot of natural resources, like the ones just mentioned. They have a huge supply of workers because they've had a agricultural revolution. So they've got a lot of people who are able to do that work because they're no longer needed on the farms. And because of their mercantilist global empire, the largest that has ever existed eventually in time period 3, they have the wealth. They have independently wealthy people that can afford to invest in businesses who will allow this to happen. Because we know to start a business, you're not going to make any money over your cost for several years. And most of us cannot afford to do that. So either we need wealthy individuals to put up the money, which they have. We also need a banking system that will loan out to entrepreneurs, which they have. So land, labor, capital are really the things that happen. And why first in Britain? Because they have all of those things in greater supply than anybody else. That has a lot to do with it. And there's numerous other factors, but that's part of it. Textile production is what we start with. We know primarily cloth, wool, and then of course cotton through their colonies, especially India and then Egypt in the 19th century are great sources of cotton production. So that's why they have such major roles in the British Empire. We also know that Britain has an excellent university system. So they're churning out engineers, inventors, scientists, mathematicians, et cetera, who can help create these things. We know there is government support. They have the Royal Society of London, where the nerds get together and talk about their ideas, and whoever's got the best one, the government's going to give them some money to develop those ideas. So all of that helps create a system of prosperous trade and eventual global domination. They also have a parliament made up mostly, if not entirely, of wealthy middle and upper class people. So they're supportive of industrial production because oftentimes they're the ones literally making the money off of the factory production. So all those factors come together to those things. Other people struggle because they don't have access to those things. France will industrialize by the end of the time period, but they go slower. They do not go as quickly. Now, one of the negatives of going so quickly is it's so fast that a lot of people are going to struggle to keep up. Those of us at the bottom end of the economic section are going to struggle to keep up because many of us, like farmers in the winter, would sew clothes to make ends meet when we're not, growing food. Of course, that's going to be hit by industrial production. So we talk, for example, about the Luddites, people who literally break into factories and try to destroy machines to keep their jobs viable. And no matter what time you're in, no matter where you are, anytime there's new tech, those of us at the bottom of the skill pyramid, those of us with the least training, the machines can much more easily take over those jobs are going to suffer. But society in the long run will benefit. And that's true now. It's true 200 years ago. It's true 2,000 years ago. That's just kind of the way that works. So when we look at South and East Europe, your study guide goes into a large amount of description here, but basically most of those states don't have natural resources as plentiful as the British or the Germans do. They don't have the trade relationships as easily available. It's kind of like Eastern Kentucky. There's a lot of people would love to work in Eastern Kentucky, but the transportation's a challenge. So coal mines are closing. What do? Where do we build a factory? We don't have enough flat land. If we build a factory, how do we get it to a production center where it can easily be spread? Because every mile I drive in a truck is profit lost to a company. So that's all part of it. And of course, we still have feudalism in much of South and East Europe, and we cannot have an industrial revolution until people are literally able to leave the countryside and go to cities and work. So all of those factors are important in this process. All right, all of that I'm sure is familiar. Just good to jog the old memory. Questions about any of that? Cool, awesome. And then all of you did a project on the Industrial Revolution, so you can all add in some level of detail about the impacts, the pollution, child labor, women being able to work, but of course being treated unfairly, the rise of the middle class, blah, 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 blah. All right, all those things are part of that process, and I'm not going to get into all those details, but I think all of you are fairly comfortable with that. Any questions on the effects of it? Many good, but also many quite bad. Okay, then on 6.3, page 134, we see the second wave or the second IR. This is going to happen in mid to late 19th century. We're going to expand our capacity. This is when we have the invention of the Bessemer process, which allows us to mass produce high quality, relatively cheap steel. We will therefore start to see the building of larger buildings because steel is strong, it is fire resistant, and it is safe for us to build taller structures. So we start seeing what you and I would call skyscrapers, much smaller than modern times, but 10, 15, 20 stories, which you would never build something that tall out of wood. for a variety of reasons. We also know that we're going to have chemical production. 1869, Dmitri Mendeleev produces the first periodic table. And so we start to understand more about chemical production. So we start to produce chemicals to do the job of natural products more efficiently, like chemical fertilizer, as opposed to just collecting animal feces, which is not fun for anybody. One that I thought was pretty interesting. I love on PBS. I know, shocking that I watch PBS, but there is a documentary series called The American Experience. They've got a two-parter next week on President George W. Bush, which is the president ones are always fascinating, I think. Tuesday and Wednesday night on PBS. But they did one on the birth of the FDA in America, the Food and Drug Administration. And they talked about when we start having these chemical productions created in the 1860s and 70s, we don't know the side effects. It's kind of like right now, we're all looking for a vaccine for coronavirus, but we also have to see, does it cause additional harms that are not worth the risk of the impact? Like anytime you watch a TV commercial about a drug and it says may cause this, that kind of stuff, even though it causes those things, the risks are fairly small for most of us, or the drug wouldn't be allowed on the market. So that's why we're doing it. And I think y'all know that because you understand basic science. A lot of people don't. Therefore, why can't we just take the drug? Well, what if 6 months from now, X happens? That's why we got to have a little bit of research to figure it out. And that's what they're doing right now. And they're working really fast. And that's encouraging. But anyway, I digress. They had discovered formaldehyde and chemical production of formaldehyde. Now, when I talk about formaldehyde, what do we most often know that to be used for?
Dead bodies.
Yeah, or like
Preservation of them.
Yeah, so like embalming, or like a biological classroom, and you see like jars of animals preserved. Yeah, well, they started to say, well, it can preserve stuff, so they put it in milk because it made milk stay fresh longer. It was also poisoning people, so whoops. So there are some good things about the massive increase in chemical production, and there are some bad things, such as we just kind of throw stuff in there, and that's why we create the Food and Drug Administration in the United States and similar organizations all across Europe. All right. Also, railroads are going to be mass produced on a much greater scale. Railroads are starting to move at speed. The first railroads in the early 19th century went about 10 miles an hour. The first commercial railroad, George Stephenson's Rocket, had a top speed of 12 and an average speed of 4 miles an hour. I slow walk faster than that. So, heck, I walk faster than 12. So that's pretty slow. But by the late 19th century, we've got a massive network of railroads reaching across the continent. We've also got, of course, much faster trains going 40, 50 miles an hour, massively reducing transportation time, increasing connectivity, blah, 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 blah. We also see communication improvements, the telegraph, later the telephone. You all know my fascination with the transatlantic cable, which is first laid in the 1850s, crossing the entire depth of the Atlantic Ocean, and it's still there today. I find that fascinating. One of my favorite follows on Instagram, and I know you guys have got to get on this because you're always looking to expand your follow base. It's one called Cool Maps Every Day. And last week, this guy had one about underwater cables around the world, which was real. And there's quite a bit of them. Well, everything's wireless now. Yeah, but to have wireless, you still have to have wires somewhere. Without, that's about the extent of my computer science knowledge, but you got to have wires somewhere. And there's still millions of miles of cables on sea floors and ocean floors all around the world, which I think is pretty interesting. So anyway, what this does is help create the middle class. We start to see more people have more time off from work. They start to have better income, and so they can have leisure. We talked about mass leisure culture. Can anybody remind me of an example or two of mass leisure culture? What is something that is developed in the mid to late 18th or 19th century for fun?
Baseball.
Okay, sports. In Europe, soccer mostly, but yes, absolutely. Professional sports. Obviously, the sports existed, but to pay to watch professionals do it. Anything else? I'll take one more.
Weren't magazines like a newer thing?
Yeah, absolutely. Because we have the money to buy them, we have the time to enjoy them, and because of the creation of public schooling and more people are taking advantage of that, we have the ability to read them. All coming together in the mid to late 19th century. Bicycles, serialized novels like Charles Dickens, I told you all, his novels don't come out in book form at that time. They come out once a month and by chapter because he made more money that way. So that's why he did it that way. Plus, I mean, no offense if you like Dickens or if you're not familiar with him, but that way you could get over the crippling boredom that would occur once you finish a chapter. So to each their own, but boy, great expectations I did not have, and they were not met. Let's just put it that way. Old Charles, I read A Tale of Two Cities, and it was the worst of times. There was no best of times. But anyway, I digress. So I hope maybe you will enjoy Dickens. That's great. You know, whatever, and you get a chance. It's classic for good reason, but not my particular style. All right. So those are some of the changes brought by the Industrial Revolution. Questions about any of that? Okay. Moving on. I'm not going through all the details. We're just hitting the high points. You have these documents. You can go through them. I'm almost done going through everybody's review assignment, and I should post those in a collective Google file later this week. And if you want to go look at a couple of them, you don't want to look at them all, but if you need help with a particular topic, most of y'all did a really excellent job. And a few people had to touch it up a little bit, but for the most part, they were very good. So I appreciate your all's effort on that. All right, I got ahead of myself, oddly enough, because 6.4 is the social effects of industrialization, and I started talking about all those things. So we kind of already hit that one. But just briefly, we know that we see these changes for a couple of reasons. Number one, less likely, but some factory owners and managers realize if they treat their workers better, they will more easily retain workers, and they'll be happy to be there, and they will come to work and do their job to the best of their ability without you making them. So a positive work environment is something that is starting to become understood by owners and managers, that helps. We also, of course, have the government passing laws. This is not laissez-faire capitalism. Clearly, the government is intervening in these things because they feel it's in the public interest. So things like the Factory Act of 1833, where we limit that 9-year-old and kids and younger can't work in factories, and 10 to 12-year-olds have to get 1 hour of schooling for every 4 hours in a factory. And then we passed numerous other acts over the course of the next 75 years in Britain. We'll eventually see that elsewhere in France, Germany, Italy as well. And then, of course, we also have the rise of labor unions, workers themselves coming together to push for opportunities for themselves. Eventually, by the end of this time period, creating the Labor Party, which will eventually, in time period 4, overtake the Liberals as the leading leftist party in Great Britain. That is still the case today. So the opposition party to the Conservatives is not the Liberals, it's the Labor. And that party is, by definition, by name, started as a workers' party with some twinges of socialism. Now, speaking of socialism, we know, and we'll get to that in a little bit later, but Karl Marx had talked about violent revolution. In places like Britain, we don't see the violent revolution part, but we have many socialists who it's either called evolutionary socialism or the modern term democratic socialism, that we should use government money and redistribute it from taxes from the wealthy and middle classes to help poor people. But we should do so through legislation, through voting, not through violent protest. And so that is the more common influence of socialism today, not violent revolution, but rather gradual change through legislation and government action. All right. Cool. Ooh, a couple other social things. We start to see, as we get wealthier in society, we see people living primarily in nuclear families. Nuclear meaning what?
Mom, dad, and 2 kids.
Yeah, 2.4 children eventually, correct? Yes, because we know birth rates decline because of industrialization. As more women have the opportunity to work, they choose to do so, or have to do so in some cases, to provide for their families. Also, we know that kids are going to go to school and therefore cost money and don't really bring in money. So it's a financial issue as well. We also have the process later dubbed the cult of domesticity, that young women can work, sure. Poor women have no choice regardless of their marital status, but a middle-class woman, as that class starts to emerge, she can work because she's got to bring something to a marriage economically. But when she gets married, that's it. It's time for you to go home and be a good mother and wife. So that's really all you're good for, and that's all we care about. So that is called the cult of domesticity, where we are going to pressure women, and also men. You're a bad husband and an unfit man if your wife works and you have any means. But what if she wants to? Nah, why do we care what women want? I mean, come on. Like that's important. And we will see this, I mentioned, in World War I, when we need millions of women to step up and take the jobs of men. We have to overcome some of these social pressures we put on women for a century and say, oh, no, we told you couldn't work and you're a bad mom if you do. We're lying. We need you to get out there. Go ahead. So we have to radically try to rechange on the fly, which is why one of the major effects of World War I is massive increases of rights for women, such as the right to vote in most countries. All right, so that's it for that. Questions on any of those things? Okay, 6.5, it talks about life after Napoleon, the concert of Europe. the agreement that comes out of the Congress of Vienna in 1815 that restores balance of power. Nobody has a bigger army. Nobody has a bigger weaponry advantage over anybody else. We sign a bunch of treaties, so we are less likely to fight with each other because we have too much at stake economically. We'd much rather make money by buying and selling goods than we would by fighting each other. And we know, therefore, that era is very conservative. We see a little bit of rise here and there. There was a revolution in France in 1830, doesn't come from much. Les Mis is about the late 1820s in France, for example. A lot of people think it's the big one in 1789. It is, in fact, not. I've never seen it or read it or never plan on doing it unless I'm kidnapped and forced to under threat of torture. But outside of that, I at least know enough context to get it. And that's okay. You can like musicals. That's fine. I despise them. To each their own. It's okay. All right. I mean, granted, my taste is better than yours, but it's you're entitled to your own taste. It's fine. I used to like crap too, and then I became cool. So we all change over time. It happens. Trust me. There'll be things you look back and that you listen to in high school and be like, oh God, what was, you know, regrets. I've had a few. Let's just put it that way. And then there's some guilty pleasures that remain a bedrock of your fun listening regardless, and you just don't let your friends know you like that song anyway, or movie, or whatever it may be. For me, it's The Bachelor. Love it. Can't get enough of it. Love The Bachelor. That's my jam. Moving on. Anyway, so we have this guy called Clemens von Metternich, the Prime Minister of Austria, who is the architect of this system. Sometimes the period from 1815 to 1848 is either known as the Age of Metternich, or it's a reactionary period. Those kings and queens that have been deposed by Napoleon, we put them back. If they're dead, their kids, their brothers, whoever, we're putting them back on the throne, and we're going to pretend like the French Revolution never happened. All right? We're going to party, not like 1999, like Prince said, but like 1789, before all this revolution starts, and just pretend like everything is still the same. Of course, it is not. The big flare-up happens in 1848. We see revolutions across the continent. Britain is too liberal. They already have what they want, so no there. And Russia is too conservative. They kill anyone who tries, so no dice on that one. The problem is 1848 is a year of revolution where nothing much changes. A lot of promises are made. People take away from the streets and go back to their homes. And then 6 months later, nothing gets better. We promise constitutions in some states. Metternich is overthrown. The leader of France, Louis Philippe, is overthrown, and then the person that takes their place is going to follow a lot of the same policies. I'm always reminded of the Who song, Won't Get Fooled Again. Meet the new boss. He's the same as the old boss, which I think is very true in that regard. But it is a reactionary time period, and as I'm sure all of you remember from your political spectrum, reactionaries go back. What we have is too far. It's not enough to keep things. We've already made mistakes. We got to go back to the way things used to be. And so that's a good term to use when describing these concepts. All right. Now, we do see a few changes here and there, but for the most part, things stay the same. An example is Russia. Now, Russia is about as conservative as it gets, reactionary as it gets. Russia in the 1850s, if you remember, fights a war with the Ottomans, which they thought would be an easy pushover, called the Crimean War. The Ottomans, however, have friends in Britain and France. But after the British and the French care about Ottoman survival, they care about potentially the Russians getting their crap together and challenging Western European authority. So the British and the French send in troops, industrial weapons, and the Russians are defeated. This makes the Tsar at the time, Alexander II, just kind of take stock. Whenever things happen in your life that aren't good, you go for a job promotion and you don't get it, you kind of go home and pout for a while and are sad and cry and eat a bunch of Haagen-Dazs. And then when you get over it, you start thinking, okay, what do I do next to limit this happening again? How do I improve myself? What went wrong? You mourn, and then okay, let's take it as a positive. We all have failures in our life. How do we learn from failure, and how do we improve? Well, the Russians are going to try to do this. And so the big action coming out of it is, we are not an industrialized power. Yes, we are huge. Our army was bigger than the British and the French combined, and we still got waxed because they had weapons we don't have. So we have got to industrialize. But old Alex looks at the rest of Europe, and he sees that they are industrialized because of their workforce. So we've got to end serfdom. So we outlaw serfdom, 1861. We free the serfs, millions of them at a time, somewhere between about 25 to 30 million people are freed. Of course, however, they have no land, they have no job skills, they have no idea what to do. It's very similar to the freeing of slaves after revolutions in the Americas and also after the American Civil War. You're free, yay! That's it. You're kind of on your own, and the problems that were there before still exist. and you're going to have to, it's going to take, generations to overcome them. So we have some industrialization in Russia by the end of this time period, but not a whole lot, because most of us are still poor peasant farmers. Now we owe money on loans instead of living in a feudal situation. Not saying feudalism is good, but there's not a good plan of what to do after. They're like, yeah, we freed the serfs. They never went like, so what do we do next? Oh, that's a bit of a problem. Okay. It's kind of like the crap teacher that knows they're getting observed. And so they pull together their best lesson that'll be good, as opposed to the normal crap they do, like pass out worksheets or something. And the administrator comes in like, wow, that was a good job. And then the kids are kind of like, what is this? We never do anything like this. And then the next day they go back to the crap worksheets. It's like, yeah, you did one good thing because you're getting watched. Well, what do you do after that? Oh, didn't think of that, did you? That's why I'd be a mean principal if I was. I'd go in and observe somebody. I'd come back like 2 days later unannounced and see if it was still something similar they were doing, like, watching videos or something. So anyway, at least for social studies, because I know some of us do that. All right. Anyway, 6.7, what are our ideologies? This is all the isms. We've talked about some of this. So we know liberalism, change is good. People like the utilitarians, giving more rights to more people. For example, of liberals. Liberals in the 19th century in Europe wanted a written constitution. We wanted our rights guaranteed in writing. You saying you're going to do it isn't enough. We want it in writing. We will see this later on when the Tsar in 1905 in Russia says, I will give you all a parliament. And they're like, cool. And then the first 2 times we elect a parliament, he goes, too liberal, and makes them vote again. So if it ain't in writing, we don't necessarily feel good about it's going to actually happen. We also expand the ability to vote over the course of the 19th century. By 1914, in most countries, pretty much all men can vote. Women are going to vote shortly after that, but we know by 1914 we've gone from about 4 to 8% of voting populations in Western nations to up to 60, 70, 80%. And then after World War I, you just had millions of men fighting for their lives, for their country. They probably should be able to vote as well. And the same goes for women at that time. So that's some of those changes. We also know that we have on the left the socialists. We'll talk briefly. This is a good time to talk about old Karl Marx. Your study guide calls it scientific socialism. He believes that history is a history of class struggle, and we've always improved the lives of workers over time, from Roman slavery to feudalism to the overthrowing of the elite in the French Revolution. Those things were positive steps, but we're still not where we want to be, but we're getting closer and closer. And one day, of course, the proletariat, the workers, will violently overthrow the bourgeois middle class, the managers of factories, the merchants, etc., and we will take over power in the world. It will spread and it will be global. We don't need a government. We don't need leadership, because we will lead it together as people. Ha! And those that won't give up their rights and privileges will be killed. So that's going to throw a lot of people off. That whole murdering thing is not something that's going to get widespread support amongst people in many societies. So that's Karl Marx. He is really a socialist. Communism comes later in the Soviet Union because we're going to force it. The primary difference, as you may remember, is socialism is the people rise up to attempt to create equality. Communism is the government forces down. And we don't see that in this time period outside of about 3 months in the Paris Commune in 1871. So we see that in time period 4, which we aren't covering. So therefore, we don't worry about that. Socialists are on the radical spring. They're one major change, that far left group of people. Also down there towards the bottom are anarchists, people that want no central government authority at all. Sometimes they can be far left anarchists, sometimes because they want to create a new society. Sometimes they want to get rid of technology. They want to go back. So they're reactionary anarchists. It doesn't get a whole lot of traction, but they do commit several acts of violence and terrorism. For example, Alexander II, the Tsar liberator who frees the serfs in Russia, is assassinated by anarchists in the 1880s. All right, so a variety of movements during this time period. The first half of the century, I would argue that right movements, conservative, reactionary, most prominent. After 1848, the second half, I would say, because of all the societal changes we're seeing, many of our movements are on the left. They want more change, more and more and more and more. We talked about in our debate in class with Gladstone and Disraeli, the 2 British prime ministers that lead that country for most of the second half of the 19th century. Even the conservatives are making major changes. So this is not a do nothing and stay where we are or change everything. Everybody's seeing changes. There's just so much progress and so much better nutrition and economic opportunity and public schooling and blah, 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 blah. Okay, so it mentions 19th century social reform, 6.8. A lot of this we were just talking about. This notion, it says mass-based political parties. So these are parties that are going to have lots of widespread support. The days of me just appealing to a few people because very few of us can vote are going to be done by 1914. If we're going to win political office, we've got to expand those that we reach. And you see that discussion right now. People say like, well, they're just appealing to their base. When they say things like that, political commentators do about politicians, they're not going to get anybody to vote for them based on that idea. They're just making the people that support them anyway happy. If you're going to win elections, though, in this country with fairly even sides in terms of the major political parties, you've got to reach across and get some of those people that are identify as your opposition, but kind of in the middle, close to that median. You're going to have to do something to pull them in, because otherwise it's not going to work for you. So that's kind of what we see. Labor unions we talked about. Feminism, still pretty far out there. My favorite heroines this time period, the Pankhurst women, mom and then her daughters fighting strongly for women's suffrage. The Women's Social Political Union, the WSPU, they basically take to committing acts of violence and public acknowledgement. The hunger strikes in prison, putting mailbox bombs in front of prominent politicians' house, not trying to hurt anybody, just trying to scare them and get them to do what they want. And then, of course, infamously, the woman who is going to be trampled to death by the king's horse, holding up a sign saying "Votes for Women" in their version of the Kentucky Derby. So that gets a lot of press at the time period. And that's the point of it. We also see what are called NGOs, non-governmental organizations, who start to be formed to work outside of government to accomplish tasks, things to help poor people. You have like anti-drinking groups, which eventually in the United States will result in prohibition, but we have similar movements in European societies. Abolitionism, trying to end slavery in the beginning of this time period, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so last one, 6.9, institutional responses and reform. Because of, again, businesses realizing it's in their best interest to often support change, governments realizing the power they have and the responsibility they have to help the average person, and then citizens demanding change. So we see things like legislation about waste, garbage, can't just dump poison into rivers anymore. We start to build sewer systems, public housing projects, redesigning our cities to improve them. Now, sometimes there are ulterior motives. Like in Paris, we tear down 90% of the city in the 1850s and rebuild it with huge wide boulevards that Paris is famous for today. We can sit in a sidewalk in a cafe and watch people walk by and all that good stuff. Yeah, the reason that was done is so that you can't have rebellions, because in narrow medieval streets, you can blockade and it's harder to get in there with government troops. Big wide streets, you can send in your advantages, your cannons and all that stuff, and they're not going to last very long, which is what happens in the Paris Commune. Also parks, a lot of parks in European cities used to be royal hunting grounds. And so we're going to turn those things into public spaces for people to relax. And so that's a huge part of urban life, green space, etc. You go to Paris, they've got tons of parks, London, lots of parks, Berlin, lots of parks. All that is a characteristic of major European cities and eventually cities around the world, that people like living in a city with all the advantages that have, but they also want green space. I mean, think about right now, if we didn't have parks and cities, where would people be able to go to get out of their homes and have a little bit of, R&R and sunlight? So we're very thankful for that in terms I think we never quite anticipated, but those changes are generally seen as a positive. If you look at many cities' websites or like their tourism stuff, they will often tout like, we have so many square miles or kilometers, depending where you are, of green space. And that's something that cities, tout. And that's really started to become a thing in late 19th century Europe, and then spreads popularly. All right. So that's what I have. That's through 6.9. We will do the rest of it, imperialism and whatnot, Unit 7 on Wednesday. Any questions about any of these?